And then as you get into consciousness, you're aware of yourself and your awareness, but that's considered not a fully awake person, in that somebody who is conscious but they're not integrated with society, with friends and family and so forth, is at a spectrum of fully conscious, and that's sort of a disorder, and that is a limitation. So to be fully conscious, you oscillate between being asleep and being awake, and it's not a continuous thing, and it's not a well-defined thing from many different ways.
What a big question. Consciousness from maybe a different perspective, probably a lot of overlaps, is that which registers experience. So consciousness is actually what we are. Consciousness is what registers the thinking mind. It's what registers the emotional body. It's what registers what's happening. When we exclusively identify with a thought or an emotion, it takes us a bit out of what we call consciousness. Consciousness is always here. It's what is, it's what we are. But when we exclusively identify with something other than that, then we sometimes, what we would say, lose consciousness or complete awareness of that which is here. So I'll just start with that.
So I wanted to ask you, of course, a lot of consciousness is really about relationships. And not just relationships with yourself, but relationship with others, other people's perception of you, and how the world reflects you as a mirror. So I wanted to begin with, what is love and what is self-love, and how is that relationship with yourself, and how that affects consciousness?
Well, at a general level, Carl Jung, who's detailed a lot of how consciousness works, is that what I'm conscious about myself is a small subset of what is myself, in that you can see the 2/3 of me that I'm unconscious about, that is part of what makes up me, and I'm only aware of 1/3 of the whole of me, approximately. And so the sense of consciousness is, as you said, is not just a individual internal thing. It's a relationship connection with other people, not just one other person, but the whole community of people. And so being in love, in a sense, is how aware am I of your conscious awareness, and are we kind of in agreement or resonance in that way? And that there's this concept called limbic resonance, where there's our limbic system, which is the part of our nerves that run our limbs, and that's the subconscious part of who we are physically. And when two people are in resonance, for example, when a psychotherapist is seeing a patient, the limbic system of the patient, which might be in distress, resonates with the limbic system of the therapist, so they become in a state of limbic resonance between the two. And that is how the psychotherapy process works, and that it turns out that if you do experiments on different kinds of psychotherapy, different styles, it doesn't matter which kind is used, the result turns out to be the same, where it's a period of time in limbic resonance, talking in whatever modality is useful, and it actually works pretty similar if it's a meditation or a yoga practice, where the time of resonance with the other people is what matters. And then we experience this in a group like this, where we each can feel the mood in the room, which is the group limbic resonance, which is a feeling of connection with each of the people. And so in the case of love in particular, was the question, is that a stronger resonance with another person? And then it gets into another concept called a theory of mind, where each of us has a simulation of the other running in our mind, where you can see me and you can sort of predict what I'm likely to do and what I'm feeling. And like if I'm not feeling well, you can probably feel it even if I don't know I'm not feeling well. And if I'm likely to do this, maybe that fits your theory of mind of what I'm likely to do or not, but now that I get it, it certainly enters into your simulation model of me. And people who are more intensely connected, like in love, maybe have a more accurate theory of mind simulation of the other person and a more resonant limbic connection with the other person. And this persists over time and waxes and wanes. There's a great book on this topic called A General Theory of Love by Lewis and Lannon and others, and it goes into this kind of concept in great detail.
In my experience and in working with clients, love is not something to get from the outside, from somebody else. Love is actually the essence of who we are. So we have access to love all the time. It's not something to obtain elsewhere. And if it's something that we're not experiencing in the moment, there's usually something else distracting, obscuring, if you will, from our capacity to actually access it. So love being what we are and who we are, if a thought comes through and I entertain that thought exclusively, I temporarily often lose access to the feeling sense of unconditional universal love. When it comes to connection with other people, it merely takes two people that basically have an agreement to drop into a heart-centered space where we both access this universal connectedness. We are all one, truly, and we are just accessing that and experiencing that with other people. Brings me to the Loving AI project. My dissertation was basically on how the coach shows up, how they identify themselves, and how that impacts the transformational capacities in that space between the coach and the client. And a heart connection, that open capacity to connect with another human being as the primary foundation, is absolutely essential to healing. And that's something that you have probably spoken to a little bit as well. So love truly is the platform for healing in this world. And to do that, we don't have to go get it anywhere. We just have to actually recognize that it's already here and it's already who we are, and just notice what's here that is possibly in the way from me experiencing this love that we are in myself and then in another. And I can really only experience the depth of love in other people that I see and allow in myself. So self-awareness and self-love is paramount to loving another human being.
So it's more practically, and I know a lot of people here are really in the token ecosystem, in the blockchain ecosystem, and they have people on their team, in their community that they're building. So sometimes, what you see and what you experience outside is a reflection of you and your judgment. And sometimes it's a reflection of what you believe in your charges. How do we, as a community, practice love?
Well, so love customarily is, people talk about a feeling between two people, but it's much more general than that, that it's a feeling amongst self and other. And the other could be your siblings, it could be your parents, it could be your family, it could be a community. It's not just a one-to-one thing. And that how you experience love, it can be also a team experience. And that's an aligned interest and a resonance amongst the people, and a sense of trust that you can trust that your expectation of what is going to happen matches theirs, and you have a common goal. And that from a mechanistic point of view, if you think about our right brain and our left brain and the different subsystems in our brain, they converge into one synthesized consciousness. And that an extension of that beyond the self is how we maybe have a shared consciousness of two people or a shared consciousness of this room. And that's a team resonance and a team shared goal and shared expectation. And that is sort of, could be described as a kind of love or alignment in a way. And so in the same way as the different subsystems of our brain consciousness create one consciousness that extends amongst multiple people, as we can feel in this room, where there's a group consciousness, if you will, and maybe positive feelings of that.
Our belief structures can often be the key piece that keep us from connecting with another human being. So if there's issues in the collective in capacity to create a state of flow, consciousness flow, or harmonized heart connection, I typically tell people, check out your own belief systems about self. It's just a reflection of what you're seeing in another. So the beliefs I have about somebody else is nothing more than just the belief I have about myself and life as a whole. And so there's a relatively famous teacher, I suppose, what circles you run in, but Byron Katie, who talks about questioning one's own belief system through the mechanism of judge your neighbor. So judging your neighbor and getting out all those beliefs about other and judgments about other is nothing more than a mere reflection of your own sense of self. So when we start to question our own sense of self and our own belief systems about who we are and who somebody else is and what's real and what's not real, we can start to break those barriers down in the collective whole.
So my final question, and this is really something I learned from Reese years and years ago, and I asked him this, always spoke about this, is really, what is global consciousness? I think both of you guys spoke about oneness, unified consciousness, and a global consciousness. And I remember Reese telling me that Facebook is a global consciousness. So can you guys explain that,
Well, that's an extension of the different subsystems coordinating together to synthesize into a unified system. So just as our right and left hemispheres, which may be separate consciousnesses if one were anesthetized or the other, can be synthesized into what we perceive as a unified experience. The same is true of this group of people in the room, or our relationships, or our families and so forth, have a collective consciousness, and that can extend to the internet, or with groups on the internet, in that the internet is a connection of several billion brains, and it has a collective consciousness on it, just in the same way as we have several billion cells in our brain that are fused into a unified consciousness. And so is the internet or subparts of it, like Facebook, are in a sense a group consciousness, whether that's Fox News or CNN or whatever. It's a sort of cohesiveness, and then there's the whole of all TV and the whole of all media on the internet. So if the internet were conscious, however, how would we even know if it were conscious any more than does our finger know what we're talking about right now? And so it's quite possible that these complex systems are converging into a conscious state, or a consciously aware state, and we as a subsystem or part of it may be unaware of what that level of connection is doing or thinking, or what direction it is. But it's likely that these things are connected and are working in a cohesive way, and so their likely behavior is going to be more like something that is conscious, or certainly something that's at least intelligent, rather than something that is not.
There are theories and studies that are out there studying the levels or stages of consciousness in individuals as well as groups. So we are actually able, through various methodologies, we're able to measure where somebody's level of consciousness is currently operating at. We can do that from an individual level, and we can look at that also from a collective level. So we can measure the level of consciousness by the city, by the company. We can take a look at different companies and how they operate. For like example, here in San Francisco, we can take a look at Google and Apple and any other company, and we can tell what the collective consciousness is of that company. So we're able to measure that on an individual level as well as a collective level, and they do operate at different levels of consciousness. And so the level of consciousness that is creating our technology is the level of consciousness we are exponentially putting out there. So it's paramount as well to start looking at what level of consciousness am I as an individual operating at. What can I do to become more conscious and more aware in how I see self, other, and world? And what about my surroundings, family, and work? How am I engaging in that, and how am I contributing to the collective as a whole?
And I wanted to ask you about the AI project just for a little bit, and just really talk about, the creating the Loving AI module, and having Sophia actually work with humans so that they can transcend, become more loving and aware.
Yeah, thank you. Just a little background. I may hand the microphone back to you at some point. Michelle was a part of our Loving AI team for a bit, as was Kirill over there. And we work with Hanson's Robotics and Sophia, the robot. I don't know if you all are familiar with Sophia. She, just for perspective, she operates under different protocols at different times. So she's not always under the Loving AI protocol. And we just did a round 2 of the Loving AI experiments around avatars versus real human being interactions and Sophia the robot, to start in audio only, to start to get a feel for how people feel when they interact with Sophia, or when they interact with an audio, a voice, or when they interact with an avatar on the screen, and when they interact with that robot that is coming from a very loving perspective. A robot that knows how to listen, actively listen. A robot that knows how to not judge. A robot that knows how to engage as best as possible. And so the results are staggering. The responses of people and how they feel coming in, and the nervousness about engaging with a robot, or the nervousness of engaging in something that they're not sure is going to happen, and how they feel afterwards, after they've engaged with something that is quite loving and responsive, and simply listening and taking in information and being present. We've learned a lot from this research in just the presence of Sophia and how she shows up and the impact that has on human beings. And we're actually quite surprised at how people come in feeling unsure, and how they leave feeling like this felt really good. I feel a greater sense of love for self, and I feel a greater sense of love for robots, and I feel a greater sense of love for the world. So the results are actually so far looking pretty good in terms of how we use technology and how we implement this sense of presence and love in the technology.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. And just looking at the experiments and the videos that we have, and just seeing Sophia react. And this is a robot, right? And not a human. It's been amazing. And so we scripted based on the eye conscious framework.